Hey everybody, welcome to Always Bored Never Boring. A little while back I did a video on HeroQuest and called it Does HeroQuest Need House Rules? I obviously love HeroQuest and I'm quite happy to play it rules as written, so the answer was no, but that wouldn't make for a very interesting video, so I went through a few of the rules that people might have concerns about and suggested some minor tweaks and house rules that could be employed. Today I'm going to ask the same question about Advanced HeroQuest, mainly because I've already done a 3-part playthrough on the channel using mostly rules as written, so I wanted to follow up with some opinions on things I would normally change slightly or would consider changing slightly, and also because I just want an excuse to talk about one of my favourite games. So let's get straight into this as we consider a few very quick and easy adjustments you can make to a game that is arguably one of the easiest games ever made to mod and create content for. Number 1. Generating heroes. Advanced HeroQuest has a very simple way of generating heroes randomly. It's all based around rolling different dice and then adding modifiers based on your race to get your starting stats. It's a really quick, fun system. The only problem is, there's no way to mitigate bad dice rolls, so it's possible to end up with a totally useless character. There are, honestly, dozens of ways to resolve this issue. Here, I'm just going to look at a few. The first is to take a leaf out of D&D's book and use dice pools. Instead of rolling for each of your stats in turn, you roll all of your dice together and then allocate the numbers to the stats as you wish. For example, weapon skill, bow skill and speed all require you to roll a d6 and then add a modifier. Rather than rolling for each skill in turn, roll 3d6 and then allocate the results however you want to those 3 stats. In this manner you have some control over which stats are the best, but you still might have to deal with some results that aren't great. Another option is to pay to upgrade some of your stats. Heroes normally start the game with a random kitty between 50 and 80 gold. Using this method, all heroes start with 80 gold, however they can spend up to 30 gold on boosting stats. It costs 15 gold to boost one stat by 1 point, you can only boost each stat by a maximum of 1, and you can never boost a stat beyond the maximum value you could have rolled for it. For example, humans roll a d6 plus 4 for their weapon skill, which means the maximum possible value is 10. That means even by spending gold to boost the stat, you could never go higher than 10. Additionally, you would only be able to increase that stat by a maximum of 1 point. A third option is one I like to call no fate but what we make ourselves. Each hero normally starts with 2 fate points, which are incredibly useful. However, if you want, you can choose to start the game with just a single fate point. If you do this, you are allowed to boost all of your stats by 1 point, although none of them are allowed to go above the maximum level you could have rolled. As gaining a fate point requires spending 1000 gold or completing a mission quickly, giving up one of your starting fate is no small thing, but if your stats are terrible, it may be worth it. A final method is to allow yourself a certain number of rerolls. 3 seems a good amount. You work through the stats rolling them individually, and at any time you can choose to reroll a result. You can reroll the rerolls, but once you are out of rerolls, you are stuck with whatever the dice give you. If you prefer to have some kind of cost to offset the benefit of a reroll, consider letting the Games Master draw a dungeon counter every time you reroll. Something else you can do when creating your heroes, and something I think is really worth considering, is pooling your gold to ensure the characters can afford the equipment they want. For example, a wizard starts with the maximum amount of spell components they are allowed and can only buy a dagger and a few items of equipment, so it might be worth letting the wizard loan some cash to your frontline fighter to ensure they can afford a decent weapon and some good armour. This can be a massive help in the first few missions when money is tight and heroes are just muddling through. Anyway, I think I've made my point. There are lots of ways to tailor character creation, and they can be as simple as allowing a reroll to as complicated as creating bespoke character classes that apply additional benefits to some stats. Number 2. Doors. This is a nice easy one. Doors in Advanced HeroQuest are 1 square wide, and that means fighting can often bottleneck around them. You stick your strongest fighter in the doorway, and they stand there toe to toe with one enemy at a time, taking away any advantage in numbers the enemy may have. While there are some ways to break this strategy, such as using magic, diagonal attacks, ambushes, sentries, or dropping wandering monsters in the corridors, it's still something that can happen quite regularly. Fortunately, it's incredibly easy to resolve. There, done. All doorways are 2 squares wide. Also, in case you missed it, the depth of a door base is exactly the width of a square on the board tiles. You may find it easier to pop the doors between tiles rather than on them. they are less obtrusive, but it may cause a few more problems with rooms and corridors not fitting exactly as you generate your dungeon. Number 3. Dungeon generation. There are two things we are going to look at regarding dungeon generation: generating corridors and generating rooms. Most of this involves tinkering with the tables in the rules book. In Advanced Heroquest, generating a corridor involves 3 roles, one for length, one for contents, and one for how the corridor ends. Some people complain that when rolling for contents too frequently you get a nothing result, which makes it too hard to find doorways leading to rooms. The reason for this is because you are rolling 2d12, which creates a bell curve of results, with the most common result being 13. On the chart, rolls of 5 to 15 mean the corridor is empty, and therefore that's the result you will see the most. It doesn't help that of the 23 results on the table, 17 results generate nothing or wandering monsters, while only 6 generate doors. Now some people may be fine with this. Long empty corridors build the sense of tension and give the games master longer to build up a stock of dungeon counters before the proverbial hits the proverbial. But if you would rather see more doors and therefore more rooms, there are 2 fixes. The first is the easiest, as it means you don't have to change any results on the table. Whenever you roll a wandering monster result, also add a door to the corridor. This doesn't dramatically increase the chances of a door, as wandering monsters are the tail ends of the bell curve and the least likely results, but it does increase the number of doors a little bit, and also adds an extra element to combats with wandering monsters, as it adds an extra incentive to stand your ground and kill them. The other way to increase the number of doors that pop up in the dungeon is to rework the table so the 1 door result is the most common outcome. You can do this simply by swapping the 1 door and nothing results, so 1 door will appear on the result of 5 to 15, while nothing will appear on the result of 16 to 19. In this way, 2 doors and wandering monsters will still remain quite uncommon. 1 door is the most common result, but you will also still find a decent amount of empty corridors to build that sense of dread and add to that sense of exploring a vast catacomb deep under the ground. Of course, one of the joys of Advanced Heroquest is that it's largely driven by tables, so all you need to rework anything you don't like is a piece of paper and a pen. You can design your own tables and even tailor the tables to the kind of dungeon you want to explore, adding more corridors for mazes or removing almost all instances of corridors if you want plenty of rooms. And speaking of rooms, that segues nicely into the second topic on generating dungeons: generating the rooms. When you open a door to a room, you roll 1d12. A 1 to 6 is a normal small empty room, a 7 or 8 is a small hazard room, a 9 or 10 is a lair with monsters, and an 11 or 12 is a quest room. So the most common result is a small empty room, but you could potentially get any result, finding a quest room on your first roll or never finding one at all. I think a nice simple way to ensure your adventures come to a suitable conclusion is to keep the room table as it is, but introduce a new way to roll on it that prevents you from finding a quest room too soon or too late. Consider rolling a d8 instead of a d12. This means that the room you discover is guaranteed to be a normal room or a hazard. Not only does this prevent you from stumbling on the quest room straight away, it also increases the odds of finding a hazard room from 1 in 6 to 1 in 4. From then on, each time you roll on the table, you add a modifier to the roll based on the quantity and type of other rooms you have already encountered, +1 for each normal or hazard room and +2 for each layer. In this way, you could find the quest room by the 3rd room at the earliest and by the 10th room at the very latest if you consistently rolled ones. Another option is simply adjust the room table as you play. To begin with, 1 to 6 is a normal room, 7 to 8 is a hazard, while 9 to 12 is a layer. Once you have found a hazard or a layer, the table changes, with the lowest 2 results dropping off the bottom and the top 2 results turning into quest rooms. That means a roll of 1 to 4 would be a normal room and a roll of 11 or 12 is a quest room. If you find another hazard room or layer, the same thing happens again, so a roll of 1 or 2 is a normal room and a roll of 9 to 12 is a quest room. This may sound a bit convoluted, but they are easy to implement, and there's loads of other ways you can manipulate the tables to get your preferred results. Number 4. Normal rooms. Normal rooms are an interesting aspect of Advanced Heroquest in that they aren't that interesting. They are completely empty. They are a place where the games master may spring a trap or ambush, but they are otherwise only there to build the world, to increase the sense of trepidation and put more space between you and escape should a group of enemies get the drop on you. Personally, I like normal rooms, but you may find too many normal rooms makes your dungeon just a little bit too normal. My solution to this was to introduce the furniture from HeroQuest. I don't like adding this furniture in layers and quest rooms where I like the focus to be on manoeuvring around enemy death zones, but a few bits of furniture appearing in the normal rooms helps to make the dungeons seem more lived in and gives the heroes something else to think about between fights. All of the rules for furniture are already included in the Advanced Heroquest rulesbook, you just have to add them in when you encounter a normal room. Number 5. Death Zones. This isn't a rules tweak or house rule, this is just a closer look at one of Advanced Heroquest's best but potentially most confusing rules. Death zones are genius because they add an extra level of strategy to every fight. They dictate who can fight, where you can fight them, and how you traverse the battlefield. Basically, each character exerts a death zone on all orthogonally adjacent spaces. Characters with long-reaching weapons such as spears also exert a death zone on diagonally adjacent spaces. These are the spaces the character can attack in melee. Lots of rules specify you can't do things if you are in an enemy's death zone. For example, you can't cast certain spells or open or close doors. Furthermore, some monsters have abilities that affect enemies in their death zones. Fearsome monsters, for example, will force enemies in their death zones to make a bravery test. So far, so straightforward. But there's more. If an enemy should happen to step into a character's death zone, they must immediately stop moving. On subsequent turns they can move out of the death zone without penalty, there are no attacks of opportunity, but for the time being they are stuck in place. When this happens, the character concentrates their death zone onto the enemy that moved adjacent to them. From that point on, other enemies can safely move through the character's death zone without having to stop. And that's just really clever, the character has become so intent on one target that others are free to move by. But while being very clever, it's also a rule that isn't well explained, and which creates edge cases and situations where it's not quite clear how you are supposed to handle something. This becomes particularly apparent in large battles where each hero may be adjacent to multiple enemies. So to prevent this video getting even more long-winded than it already is, I thought I would wrap up by running through my conventions for keeping the rules around the death zones as clear and simple as possible. This is not necessarily the true intent of the death zone rules, but it works for me. Number 1. When an enemy enters a character's death zone, the enemy stops and the character is turned to face that enemy. The character is now focusing on the enemy, so all other models may freely move past them. Number 2. When a character is focusing on an enemy, other adjacent enemies are still prevented from opening doors and treasure chests or casting spells. Furthermore, those other models would still have to test for bravery against an adjacent fearsome monster. Number 3. If a character decides to attack an adjacent enemy, the character turns to face that enemy and is now focusing on them. This happens regardless of whether the character was focusing on an enemy already. Number 4. If the enemy a character is focusing on is removed, either through death or simply by moving away, the character is no longer focusing on anyone, even if there are other enemies adjacent. The character remains facing the now empty space. And that's it. I find that keeps things relatively clear. And I think at this point I'm going to call it a day. I'm sorry if this has been quite a dry video compared to my usual output, and I'm doubly sorry if my usual videos are this dry, but hopefully there has been something here of interest, or some food for thought at the very least. Obviously, there is much more you could do with Advanced Heroquest, and indeed other people have already done much more, but I do like to keep my gaming experiences as close to the original design intent as possible. I have always found that if I start to tinker with things too much, then I might as well be playing a different game. But the changes here hardly deviate from what the game system does already, a game system that is very open to changing tables and tweaking odds for whatever kind of gaming experience you would like. Advanced Heroquest was, and always will be, a sandbox. It's a sandbox filled with monsters that want to kick the sand in your face all the time. But hey, everybody likes sand. Except Anakin, I suppose. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider pressing the like button. If you really enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so, and hopefully I will see you all again very soon. Bye bye everyone. Bye bye.